Alright, so today we're talking about D.H. Lawrence's novel Sons and Lovers, published in 1913. Really enjoyed this book. I think it's definitely going to be on the best of 2022 for me already. Just have a lot of good things to say about this one. It's a very interesting book. Part 1, Summary. Gertrude Coppard is the refined daughter of a well-to-do family who falls in love with a working-class miner, Walter Morrell. They enjoy a passionate physical relationship, which brings them 4 children, but their love for each other soon wanes. Gertrude becomes resentful of her husband's lack of refinement, meagre living conditions, and drinking, while Walter struggles to meet his wife's higher-class expectations of him and pushes himself away. In response to her failed marriage, Mrs. Morrell turns her passion and love towards her sons, especially her second son, Paul. As Paul becomes a man, he struggles to free himself from his mother's passion, unable to find real fulfillment in his relationships, with either Miriam, a traditional girl and a farmer's daughter, or the more modern feminist Clara Dawes. No matter how hard he tries to love these women and make a life for himself, Paul is always drawn back to his mother. Part 2, Sons and Mothers. Although Sons and Lovers does centre around the lives of the Morrell family, and it also details Paul's life as an artist and his struggles there, the real thing that attracts me to the novel and the main thing in the novel is the relationship between Paul and his mother. And it's definitely the kind of relationship that Freud, I'm sure, would have a lot of things to say about. In fact, the story reminded me a little bit of Wuthering Heights on several levels. First of all, it's got this kind of incestuous vibe with the mother-son relationship, similar to the incestuous vibe of Wuthering Heights. Also, it's set in a rural northern town. It's not quite as gothic as Wuthering Heights, but it can be just as violent and strange in places. So it really did remind me of that novel, although it's a little bit more grounded in reality than Wuthering Heights, which just feels like it's, some kind of crazy fairy tale taking place in another reality sometimes. Paul and his mother have this very intense and close relationship. In some places it's quite touching, in other places it's quite disturbing, and as a reader you're constantly going through the motions with this relationship. Sometimes you feel really bad for them, and you feel for them and you want them to work out their problems. Other times you hate them, especially when they are cruel to each other, which happens a lot, especially when it comes to Paul having relationships with other women and his mum just constantly getting in the way of that and stopping him from living his own life. Lawrence takes a lot of time developing Mrs. Morrell's character so that we can sympathise with her. And in fact, the first part of the story doesn't feature Paul at all. It takes place before Paul is born and focuses on Mrs. Morrell's marriage to Mr. Morrell when things were better, and then slowly watching as this marriage disintegrates. And I think this was a really good choice because it allows us as a reader to understand Mrs. Morrell in a way that we really wouldn't if we just had a story that focused on Paul and his perspective and his life. I think if that was the case, then we'd probably feel a lot less sympathy for Mrs. Morrell. Also, it's Mrs. Morrell's dysfunctional marriage that explains her relationship with her sons. The fact that she is isolated in this house and she's not in love with her husband anymore, and her husband is spending all of his time either working in the mines for 12 hours a day and then going to the pub to enjoy himself, and she's just left at home completely bored, and she has nothing to do. She has no life of her own, she has no marriage to attend to, and so what happens is that she comes to project everything onto her sons, to the point where she almost lives through her sons. When they succeed in life, she succeeds in life, because as a woman in the time period she couldn't do that on her own. So she's living through her sons, and at the same time she also seems to be using her sons as substitutes for the love that she's now not getting from her husband. And so by having this early part of the story really focus on Mrs. Morrell and that failed marriage, it just makes you empathise with her and understand her position a lot more. I think without this she'd just come across as an overbearing mother with not much to make her sympathetic. But having this earlier part really allowed us to get insight into her character and to understand what she's doing for the rest of the novel. A big part of this projection of Mrs. Morrell's onto her sons, and especially Paul, is that she stops him from having any serious relationships with women. This is especially true in the case of Miriam, who is single and therefore an actual candidate for Paul to marry. She constantly gets in the way of this relationship, and she's fiercely jealous of Miriam. On the other hand, she seems more open-minded when Paul meets Clara Dawes, but it seems to me that the only reason why she's happier with him to engage with Clara in a romantic way is because Clara is actually married, although separated from her husband, and therefore she's not a threat to Mrs. Morrell in the same way that Miriam was. And this is quite a toxic thing, because if you're pushing your son towards the married woman, even if she is separated, and not the woman who you can actually marry, that's certainly not a good thing to be doing. And it really shows you how warped Mrs. Morrell has become by this point in the story, the fact that she's just not willing to let her son be happy with someone, and she's only willing to let him be with women who he actually can't have. I think the moment when I hate Mrs. Morrell the most is when she breaks down in tears in order to stop Paul from marrying Miriam, and this essentially drives a permanent wedge in his relationship with Miriam. She cries and says that Miriam is going to take him away from her, basically emotionally manipulating Paul into leaving Miriam and detaching himself from Miriam, and sadly this actually works, and although their relationship is quite rocky for the rest of the novel, it never really recovers. And so this is, just an example of how bad and abusive she can get. At the same time though, because you had the early build-up, you do still feel sorry for Mrs. Morrell here. You see why she's upset in this way, because she really is losing her lifeline. She lives through her sons, and if her son gets married and goes off with someone else, then she really will have nothing left. And so while on the one hand I did feel very frustrated with her at this point in the story, I always felt for her and understood where she was coming from. And that's because Lawrence did such a good job of setting up that story and building her character and making her complex and interesting enough that when she does terrible things, you still understand why she's doing them. Towards the end of the story, Paul really does start to detach himself from his mother in some ways. And this coincides then with his mother becoming ill and eventually, sadly, dying at the end of the story. I found this really interesting because again, symbolically it shows how the mother really is connected to her son. And so when her sons start detaching themselves and moving away, she actually becomes a lot weaker and actually dies, symbolizing the fact that she really is nothing without her sons because she has nothing outside of them. But what's even more tragic is that the story kind of leads you to believe that when the mother dies, it might be the case that Paul will actually be able to have fulfilling relationships with women and move on, but unfortunately this doesn't happen. The end of the story is very ambiguous, with Paul thinking about going back to Miriam but then not doing it, and deciding that he's going to leave town and begin life somewhere on his own. Now this ending actually surprised me because I did think that Paul would manage to come back to himself at the end of the story with his mother dead. And Lawrence even hints at this because the chapter in which Paul's mother dies is called Release. And so obviously there's the release there in terms of her dying, but there's also the release there in the sense of Paul being released from his mother's grip. But that isn't really what happens. The relationship between Paul and his mother is so strong and he's so trapped in it that even after her death, she's still there stopping him from having these relationships. And so the end of the story is pretty dark and pretty sad. Overall, I just think this theme is fantastically done here. I've never really read a book that just focuses on the relationships that a young man has with the main women in his life, i.e. his mother and his lovers. Usually family saga stories with male protagonists, they tend to focus a bit more on the kind of antagonistic story between the boy and his dad, whereas in this story, Mr. Morrell is kind of present at the beginning, but as the story progresses, he really does fade into the background, which makes sense because although Mr. Morrell is quite a violent character, Paul doesn't really have much of a relationship with his dad and he's not a big part of his life. It's the relationship with his mother that's the significant one, and so that's the one that the novel focuses on. And I just found that really interesting, that a story really goes there and really explores all these dark webs and dark entanglements of all these kinds of relationships that men have with their mothers and also with their lovers. And as I said in the introduction, it's definitely a story that Freud would have a lot to say about, because there's definitely something a bit untoward about the relationship between Paul and his mum in places. Now, part 3, the Morrell family. Although I enjoyed the novel pretty much start to finish, I have to say that my favourite bits of the novel were the early parts where we're focusing more on Gertrude, Mrs. Morrell, and her marriage, and Paul's youth when he's a child growing up. I found these bits just really vivid in terms of scene setting, in terms of character development, and while I do love the rest of the book as well, these bits just really stood out in my mind and were really fantastic bits of work. What I liked the most about this part of the book was how meticulously Lauren crafted the disintegration of this family relationship. Not just in terms of the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Morrell, but how that's affecting their children, who eventually come to a point where they all unanimously hate their dad and all love their mother, in a way that's very out of balance and kind of again reflects what's going to come further down the line with the relationships with these characters. Lawrence really does take his time showing how this relationship disintegrates, and it's not a case where you just have one dramatic scene that destroys everything and then they never find love for each other again. Because even later in the novel, Mr. and Mrs. Morrell just have little moments where they feel or remember the love that they once had for each other. And those are really touching, and I think they're more true to what happens in failed relationships. Even if you stay together, there might just be moments where you remember how things were, and there can be a little bit of magic, but that's just like a small moment, and the rest of it's quite bleak. What I also like is that Lawrence doesn't really paint anyone as a particular villain in the household. I think it's quite easy when people tell these kinds of stories to have a scenario where either the man or the woman is the evil one who's destroying the relationship, and the other one is a pure victim. And I don't think that's quite the case here. I think Lawrence does enough with his characters to really show that they're kind of all partly responsible in different ways for what eventually happens to them. First of all, you have Mr. Morrell, who is spending 12 hours in a mine in a dark, dreary, depressing place. And so it sort of makes sense that when he's outside of that, he's going to want to be a bit hedonistic, he's going to want to go out drinking, and his wife isn't really sensitive to that because she's bored at home, because she can't do anything, because women can't do much aside from just be housewives. So she expects some attention, which he doesn't want to give her after, the honeymoon period ends. And so he then becomes a bit distant, she then becomes resentful, and then slowly this just builds into an explosive set of rows and violence, and then obviously the children see this, and it all comes crashing down. And then basically what happens is Mrs. Morrell projects all that love onto her children, and you kind of get this weird family unit now where Mr. Morrell is basically a lodger in his own house who's completely isolated from the rest of the family, which of course makes things even worse from his point of view, and he becomes more violent and more depressed. And this obviously then reinforces the hatred that the rest of his family have for him, because they just see him as a, lout and a tyrant who doesn't care about them. So yeah, it's an incredibly complex destruction of a family relationship, and that is just really good and really hard to do well. Like I said, I think it's very easy to just fall into that trap of black and white, one person in the wrong, or one particular event destroys things. And Lawrence doesn't do that. He finds ways to understand every single character's point of view, and even if some of the characters, like Mr. Morrell or their daughter Annie or one of their sons Arthur, even if these characters are in the background a bit, you still manage to see everything from their points of view as well, even though we obviously focus a lot more on Paul, his mother, and her first son William. Part 4. Miriam and Clara. So as well as his relationship with his mother, we also get Paul's relationships with two lovers, Miriam and Clara. Miriam is portrayed as a slightly more traditional woman, and she seems to share a more intellectual relationship with Paul. At one point in the novel it says something like, if there were no books left in the world to read, then their relationship would fall apart because it's built upon stories and intellect and all those kinds of things. Paul's relationship with Clara, on the other hand, is a bit more physical and not really focused on intellect at all. So you have kind of two ways in which you can have a relationship with someone, a physical one and a more intellectual one, being kind of portrayed between Paul's relationships with these women. Now, Paul's relationship with both Clara and Miriam is all over the place, and as I was reading the story, it was quite bizarre almost, because he can go from hating them to loving them within the space of like a few seconds, and vice versa, they can also do the same with him. And it's just like this constant ebb and flow of hatred and love that he feels for them, obviously because of that pull from his mother that he feels, stopping him from ever fully engaging in these relationships. But it really does make you see another side to Paul, which up until the moment when he starts having these relationships, he's a lot more sympathetic, but when you see the way he sometimes treats these women, and also the way they treat him, you really do see a new side to him as he's developing his romantic relationships and finding that he can't really do that because of this pull that he has. If you include all three women together, then it seems like Paul gets essentially a different kind of love from all of them, and that his main problem is that with all of the three women, he can't get all three things that he wants, and that's why he can't have a satisfying relationship. He gets the intellectual kind of soul, spirit love from Miriam, he gets the physical attraction and the passion from Clara, and he gets the maternal, caring love from his mother. And each of these women seem to possess him in that one respect. His mother in one respect, Miriam in another, and Clara in the third. And Paul really struggles to try and get a different kind of love from any of them. So with Miriam, for example, he really finds it hard to see her in a physical way for most of the story. And likewise with Clara, he tends to see his relationship with her as just being one that's built around sex. And obviously with his mother, nothing ever goes that crazy, so he just gets the maternal kind of love from her. But really what he needs is to combine all of that in one person, and then perhaps he wouldn't have such a fragmented set of relationships. In terms of Clara and Miriam, I thought both of them were good characters, especially Miriam, because we spend a lot more time with her, and she has quite a progressive character arc herself. When we meet Miriam, she is kind of a shy, reserved farmer's daughter who doesn't have much going for her, and it seems like she's going to fall into a character that's very much like a mother, who's just a submissive housewife who takes a lot of rubbish from her husband and her sons. But as the story progresses, she becomes a bit more strong-willed. She has Paul teach her French and literature and all these things so that she can become a better person and a stronger person. And so it's quite nice to see that character development, whereas Clara I found to be a bit more elusive as a character. When we first meet her, she's kind of portrayed as this forward-thinking feminist. She's involved in women's suffrage, but that kind of fades away as the story kind of goes. It kind of takes a back seat to her relationship with Paul, and I wasn't really sure what Lawrence was doing with her character there, or if he was trying to say anything, or if it was just a matter of that stuff wasn't really relevant once their relationship started. So yeah, I found Clara to be probably the weakest of the main characters. Certainly not a bad character by any respect, and I found her marriage to her husband quite interesting, the fact that they are married but divorced, and this creates later on in the story a very interesting relationship between Paul and this husband who becomes more present as the story goes on. But yeah, Clara as a character I think could have just been a little bit more to make her a bit more tangible, but overall still very good. One thing that I would say about both Miriam and Clara though is that for the most part we do get them filtered through Paul's eyes. Although Lawrence isn't using a first-person narrator, it does seem that when it comes to Paul's relationship with Miriam and Clara, we really are getting his perspective of them. And this comes out because in certain passages, Clara or Miriam will like stand up for themselves and fight back against something that Paul's saying, and they'll kind of make him see himself in a different light, and you'll see something else in these characters. Like a good example of this is when Miriam is angry with Paul for spurning her, and she basically calls him a child or something, and Paul's shocked that she would say that to him and think that about him, and it makes him reassess what he thinks and believes about Miriam. So to some extent I wonder if the thinness of Clara's character might just be a symptom of that, the fact that Paul doesn't really understand Clara very much, but I'm not really sure. It's something definitely worth thinking about and talking about as well. Part 5, Atmosphere. The atmosphere of Sons and Lovers was just really vivid the entire way through. At the beginning I compared it to Wuthering Heights, and I think part of the reason why I compared it wasn't just because of the incesty stuff and the weirdness, but it was because of this really, really dense kind of prose style and just the atmosphere that evokes. Every single scene you really felt like you're there with the characters all the time. Although it's not a gothic novel by any stretch, there were just little bits in the book that did kind of evoke these gothic passages and darkness. A good example of this is when Paul sleeps with Miriam for the first time, and they do it outside, and Miriam like gets torn with some thorns because they're like dragging him into a bush or something, and it's just a really creepy scene, and it's kind of terrifying. And I think that was intentional. Lawrence wanted to kind of show a certain kind of primitive darkness to Paul's burgeoning sexuality, and the fact that he's semi-pressuring Miriam into sleeping with him as well. And I just thought this scene was really dark and twisted. Another one that I really liked was when Paul's mother's dying at the end, and Paul's standing outside, and he looks up and sees the fire in her room, and he thinks, you know, when she's gone that fire will go out. And it's just little moments like this that just add a really strong sense of atmosphere to the story. I did see in some reviews people complaining about Lawrence's prose style being quite laborious, but I quite like that dense prose style. I think so long as it really evokes an atmosphere and a sense of scene, then it's worth doing, and I think Lawrence does do that, and I never really felt bored listening to his sometimes long-winded descriptions of things, because I think he always has interesting ways of putting things, and it's always serving some good purpose, like creating an atmosphere, creating a scene, and developing characters. So for me, I found that the dense prose style was really effective and gave a great atmosphere to the story. Another part of the story that I thought was really effective is towards the end when Paul's mother is upstairs in her room dying, and Paul and his sister Annie have lots of friends around all the time, and they're kind of almost having more fun than they normally would. And obviously this is a defense mechanism to stave away the depression of what's happening. And so they just have this constant kind of circuit of guests coming around, and they're having a nice time, all the while this tragedy is going on upstairs. And again, I just thought that that was really effective. Rather than just focusing on the tragedy and everyone gathering around the bed and weeping, this is the sort of thing that actually happens in real life. You do try and find ways to keep your spirits up in times like this. And it is this very weird, surreal time, and I think, again, Lawrence just did a good job of capturing how surreal and weird that process is. Because on the one hand, you're deeply distraught and upset by what's happening, and then you're doing this kind of fun-seeking to compensate for it, but in the back of your mind, you know that, you know, what's going on upstairs. And so you just end up in this really weird situation, and I think Lawrence, again, did a really good job of just bringing that out and making that really vivid. Part 6, Conclusion. Overall, I think Sons and Lovers is a fantastic book, and it's definitely going to come up in the best of 2022 for me, because I just can't think that there's going to be much that I would read this year that would be better than this. It tells a complex story of a dysfunctional family and the effects that this has on the relationships between a mother and his son, and then how this affects his relationships to the other women in his life. And what results is essentially a double tragedy. You have the tragedy of Mrs. Morrell, who begins the story as an ambitious woman, perhaps with a lot of bright things to look forward to, slowly disintegrating into a housewife in an unsatisfied marriage, projecting everything onto her sons, who eventually move away from her, and then slowly dying at the end of the story. Then you have Paul, who again has aspirations. He's a bright child, he's got artistic ambitions, and he wants to have fulfilling relationships with women, but he can't because he's trapped in this toxic relationship with his mother. And even when she dies, he still can't break out of that cycle. And with the ambiguous ending to the story, it's really not clear whether Paul will ever break out of that cycle either. It seems like he might just go wandering on for the rest of his life. Alright, that's it for this video. If you've read Sons and Lovers, let me know what you think of the story in the comments, and let me know what you think about what I had to say about it as well. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And that's it for this video, so take care everyone. Ta-ra!